never thought a simple dinner could feel like walking a tightrope over a pit of jagged glass. But here I was, balancing charm, humility, and deception all at once. The moment I stepped into my son's in-laws' home, I could feel the weight of their expectations pressing down. Their house was immaculate, the kind of place where every vase, every throw pillow, and every carefully curated photograph screamed success. And there I was, dressed modestly, my watch deliberately plain, my car in the driveway parked discreetly around the corner. To anyone looking, I was unremarkable. The irony wasn't lost on me. The very people who might look down on me were about to discover, in the most dramatic way, that appearances were everything and nothing. From the foyer, I could see them waiting, smiling, polite, but measuring. My son greeted them first, his eyes bright with excitement, oblivious to the storm of social tension I could feel swirling in the air. I shook hands with his mother, careful to let my hand linger just long enough to convey warmth, but not enough to betray the slight tremor of anticipation. Her smile was perfect, the kind of practiced politeness that could disarm most people, but I knew her type. She was judgment incarnate, the subtle kind that could reduce a person's worth with a single raised eyebrow. I had to play it just right. Sitting down at the dining table, I allowed my eyes to drift over the silverware, the china, the crystal glasses catching the light in a calculated sparkle. Each piece whispered wealth, tradition, and social hierarchy, and my pulse quickened. I reminded myself why I had chosen this strategy, to appear modest, even financially constrained, so that when the truth emerged, the contrast would leave them unprepared. Humility would be my disguise, patience my weapon. Pride would hide behind courtesy. I smiled as my son's father tried to strike up conversation, talking about the latest tech investments and business ventures. I nodded, letting curiosity and mild self-deprecation guide my responses. "Oh, I just dabble here and there," I said, letting my tone imply that money was trivial to me, not absent. Inside, I laughed quietly, knowing that they assumed this meant I wasn't successful, that I hadn't amassed anything noteworthy. The delicious irony of underestimation always set my pulse racing. Dinner commenced. The table hummed with polite chatter and the subtle symphony of social cues. Compliments, questions, the occasional laugh, every interaction was a chess move. I carefully calibrated my answers, allowing just enough information to make them comfortable, but never enough to let them see through the veil. When my son's sister-in-law mentioned a recent European vacation, I merely tilted my head and said, "Sounds lovely." We've always loved discovering smaller, quieter towns ourselves. It was truthful enough to be humble, vague enough to conceal the reality. I could feel their eyes on me at moments, the quick glances that spoke volumes. Who is this woman? How does she live? Does she have resources, connections, taste? Every smile I offered, every sip of water I took, was a delicate balance between appearing engaged and strategically understated. The contrast between the world they inhabited and the subtle, hidden power I carried inside was intoxicating. I reveled quietly in it, even as my pulse thrummed with tension. My mind drifted to the plan. This orchestration of manners and misdirection was no accident. I had spent weeks imagining this scenario, mapping every word, every gesture, every pause. It wasn't just about wealth. It was about perception, about dismantling assumptions slowly and carefully, letting them bask in the security of judgment before the reveal. I had practiced the perfect mix of humility and restraint, of friendliness and aloofness. Every interaction at this table was a rehearsal for the moment when the facade would collapse in the most socially explosive way possible. Yet, even in the midst of this careful deception, I felt a pang of vulnerability. Pretending to be something I was not, even for the sake of a lesson, always carried risks. What if they sensed my strategy? What if my son noticed the subtle artifice? What if, in trying to impress or shock them later, I inadvertently revealed myself too soon? My stomach tightened as I pushed the doubts aside, reminding myself that tension was part of the game. Suspense, the edge between expectation and revelation, was what made this encounter so deliciously electric. As the salad course was cleared and the first hints of the main dish appeared, I observed the subtle hierarchies at play. The way the mother positioned herself at the head of the table, the father leaning slightly forward as if to assert authority, the daughter exchanging glances of approval, all of it spoke volumes about family dynamics. I noted every gesture, every pause in conversation, every laugh that seemed to measure social currency. I mirrored their tones and expressions carefully, letting my own comportment reflect just enough humility to appear unassuming. And then came the moments that sharpened my internal amusement. Small remarks, innocent on the surface, carried the weight of judgment. "It must be so nice to take the little things for granted," my mother-in-law commented, her voice sweet but her eyes scrutinizing. "We all wish we had more time to enjoy life without worrying about finances, don't we?" I smiled politely, murmured in agreement, and let her words settle in the air like a gentle trap. I felt the thrill of contrast framing. Here they assumed struggle, smallness, limitation. While beneath the surface, I was quietly, comfortably in command of resources and choice. Conversation flowed toward lighter topics: favorite books, childhood stories, hobbies. I engaged, but kept stories short, understated, as if my life had been simple and restrained. I laughed softly, nodded with empathy, and sprinkled in just enough humility to reinforce the narrative of modesty. My son watched me with a mix of curiosity and amusement, unaware of the layers at play. I was a study in control, a careful architect of perception, balancing compliance with cunning, charm with subtle manipulation. By the time dessert arrived, I had fully settled into the rhythm of this social performance. The contrasts, appearance versus reality, humility versus pride, compliance versus strategy, had reached a steady crescendo. Each smile I offered, each word I spoke, reinforced my carefully cultivated facade. And yet beneath the surface, I could sense the anticipation building. The check, the pivotal moment of revelation, was approaching like a distant drumbeat. I didn't rush it. Suspense, I knew, demanded patience. Every glance, every slight shift in posture from the in-laws added layers to the tension. The air was thick with expectation and polite curiosity, and I relished it. I allowed my demeanor to remain calm, neutral, inviting them to underestimate me further. Their assumptions were their own undoing. My strategy relied on contrast, on the sudden collision of perception and reality. My pulse quickened slightly as I imagined the moment when their judgments would be laid bare, when the subtle social equilibrium would tip entirely. And in that quiet anticipation, I found a strange sense of intimacy with these people. Not in friendship or familial warmth, but in the shared tension of social theater. We were locked in a dance of manners, perceptions, and hidden truths. I could feel the suspense thrumming through my veins as clearly as the laughter and polite chatter around the table. Every comment, every pause, every polite gesture was a note in a symphony of subtle strategy. As I sipped the last of my wine, I allowed a soft, private smile. The game was unfolding perfectly. They believed me cautious, humble, perhaps even constrained by finances or circumstance. Little did they know, every ounce of that perception was carefully manufactured, a curtain behind which rested quiet strength, substantial means, and a mind alert to every nuance. And the most potent revelation, the moment that would leave them startled, perhaps embarrassed, certainly impressed, was still to come. By the time plates were cleared and the conversation meandered toward trivialities and pleasantries, I felt a surge of anticipation. The table had become a microcosm of social expectation, perception, and unspoken hierarchy. I had navigated it carefully, balancing humor, humility, and subtlety, and I knew that every word had set the stage for the final act. The tension between appearance and reality was thick enough to cut with a knife. As the waiter appeared with the check, I felt a quiet thrill. The crescendo of suspense was near, the pivot between perception and revelation almost at hand. For now, I remained calm, my smile steady, my posture inviting trust. But inside, I was electric with anticipation, fully aware that the night's climax would challenge assumptions, upend expectations, and reveal the hidden contours of power, perception, and pride. This dinner, which had begun as a simple social obligation, had become a stage for subtle strategy, emotional tension, and moral contrast. Humility danced with pride, compliance with cunning, and appearance with reality. And as I glanced around the table, meeting the eyes of each in-law with polite attentiveness, I knew the story was only beginning. The reveal would come, and when it did, the lessons, the shock, and the satisfaction of carefully orchestrated suspense would leave an indelible impression, not just on them, but on everyone present. I leaned back slightly in my chair, savoring the anticipation, knowing that the next section, the reveal, the moral reckoning, the emotional payoff, was a heartbeat away. And with that thought, I prepared myself, inside and out, for the moment when all the contrasts, all the carefully constructed tensions would collide in a single, unforgettable moment. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my wine, feeling the swirl of tension in the room tighten like a drawn bowstring. Every smile around the table seemed sharper, every laugh more pointed. My son's eyes flickered toward me, a mix of expectation and mischief. He was waiting for me to falter, to reveal the embarrassment he so clearly relished. But I had made a quiet decision hours ago. I would play along, but not as a victim. I would transform this dinner into a subtle dance of wit, grace, and moral clarity. The first move was simple. I leaned back in my chair, adopting an exaggeratedly polite posture, and smiled warmly at one of his friends. "Oh, you must forgive me," I said with a playful tilt of my head. "I've been so used to our quiet dinners that I might spill something fancy across the table." My voice carried a teasing lilt, a gentle mockery of their expectation that I would be daunted by their opulence. There was a slight pause, just enough for a ripple of awkward laughter. I noticed my son stiffen, the first crack in the confident facade he had built so carefully. Encouraged, I continued. Each joke was self-deprecating yet clever, highlighting my simplicity without shame, allowing them to assume they were at the center of the humor. "Back home, we call a corkscrew a fancy opener," I added lightly, pretending to examine my glass. "I hope I'm using it right, wouldn't want to ruin such a delicate evening." The room tensed. Some of the guests exchanged glances, uncertain whether to laugh or admire. My son's grin wavered, a small tremor betraying his growing frustration. As conversation shifted to work, vacations, and weekend plans, I allowed myself to weave small observations that hinted at insight without confrontation. "It's incredible how the little things in life, like a sunny balcony or a quiet cup of tea, can mean so much," I said, glancing at my son. "Sometimes, I think it's the unnoticed moments that define us most, rather than the grand displays." My tone was warm, almost casual, but the message carried weight. He shifted uncomfortably, sensing the unspoken implication. Humility, thoughtfulness, and quiet strength are not weaknesses. I noticed subtle shifts among the guests. A friend raised an eyebrow, a smirk fatting into genuine intrigue. Another, attempting a pointed remark about my modest upbringing, faltered mid-sentence when I matched her tone with gentle amusement. Each response was deliberate, calibrated to maintain dignity while revealing the shallow arrogance of those who sought to mock me. I began to feel the tide turning. What had started as a stage for ridicule was becoming a mirror, reflecting the absurdity of pride cloaked in laughter. My son, increasingly restless, tried to regain control. "Mom, you're being too modest," he said, his voice betraying both irritation and incredulity. "This is a dinner, not a performance." I smiled softly, meeting his eyes directly, my expression calm. "Sometimes a little performance helps everyone see the truth," I replied lightly. The subtlety of the remark struck him, his lips tightened, and I could almost hear the cogs turning in his mind. He wanted to win this battle of appearances, but I had already shifted the rules. The tension thickened further when one of his friends commented on a piece of art in his apartment, saying, "It's impressive, though I suppose taste is learned." Without missing a beat, I leaned in, eyes twinkling, and said, "Oh, I've learned a lot from observing." Sometimes the most expensive things aren't the most meaningful, wouldn't you agree? The statement was innocuous on the surface, but the subtle implication hung in the air. Heads turned, murmurs spread. Even my son paused, caught between laughter and a rising sense of unease. I felt a quiet satisfaction building, not from revenge, but from a sense of moral victory. Each turn of phrase, each carefully measured smile, highlighted contrasts that were impossible to ignore. Humility against pride, insight against superficiality, restraint against cruelty. I was no longer playing the part of the simple, powerless mother. They were playing the part of the audience to my quiet lessons. The balance of power had shifted, imperceptibly at first, but unmistakably now. Then came the moment of climax. My son, in an attempt to reclaim the upper hand, made a remark so pointed I could feel its sting immediately. "You know, Mom," he said, leaning slightly forward, "it must have been difficult for you raising me on so little. I mean, some of us are lucky enough to have everything handed to us." Laughter bubbled around the table, and for a split second I saw the satisfaction in his eyes, the cruelty laid bare. I paused, letting the words linger. My heart pounded, but my voice remained steady. "Yes, it was difficult," I said softly, looking around the table. But sometimes, the challenges we face teach us lessons that money can't buy, lessons in patience, resilience, and love. And isn't it interesting? I continued, a faint smile curving my lips. How those who think they have everything to give sometimes have the most to learn. The room fell silent. Some guests shifted in their seats, the tension palpable. My son's jaw tightened. I could see the realization dawning slowly, like sunlight creeping through clouds. I let the silence stretch, giving weight to the words, allowing the contrast to sink in fully. Arrogance versus integrity, mockery versus wisdom, superficial pride versus lived experience. The air felt heavy, charged with the subtle electricity of revelation. My son's gaze dropped to his hands. I sensed the first stirrings of introspection, perhaps even shame. But I didn't push further. Moral lessons delivered in calm dignity are far more lasting than any forceful confrontation. Dinner concluded with small talk, but the energy had irrevocably shifted. The guests who had arrived expecting amusement from my supposed simplicity now looked at me differently, curiosity replacing condescension, respect edging into admiration. My son, once the orchestrator of mockery, sat quietly, caught between embarrassment and a dawning understanding. I could see it in his eyes, the beginning of a reckoning, the first acknowledgement that humility and integrity hold power in ways ostentation never can. As I prepared to leave, I felt a quiet glow of empowerment. I had navigated the evening with grace, humor, and subtle intelligence. No harsh words had been exchanged, no anger had flared, and yet the lesson had been imparted. My son had been confronted, not with shame or rage, but with calm truth, mirrored in my composure and strength. The contrasts had been clear for all to see. The power of character versus the emptiness of arrogance, the dignity of restraint against the fragility of pride. We embraced briefly at the door, a gesture warm yet layered with unspoken acknowledgement. "Thank you for coming, Mom," he said quietly. There was a tremor in his voice, a vulnerability that had been absent earlier. I smiled, squeezing his hand gently. "Always," I replied. "Always." Walking back through the streets to my small apartment, I reflected on the evening. It had been more than a dinner. It had been a quiet battle, a moral chess match played with words, demeanor, and observation. I had preserved my dignity, imparted lessons without anger, and reclaimed respect through composure and insight. The contrasts had been stark, the tension profound, and yet the resolution was elegant, human, and emotionally satisfying. In that still night, I realized something deeper. Life is not about proving others wrong with force, but about embodying strength in the quietest ways. The true power lies not in mockery or wealth, but in grace, humility, and the courage to remain steadfast in one's values. And sometimes, the most important lessons are learned not through punishment, but through the gentle, unshakable demonstration of integrity. By the time I reached my door, I felt complete. The evening had begun as a test of patience and resolve, a stage for mockery, and had ended as a quiet triumph of wisdom, love, and moral clarity. I stepped inside, closed the door gently, and let myself breathe. The night had been long, tense, and fraught with emotion, but I had played my part, and the lesson had been quietly, undeniably delivered.